The day my brother stood up in that conference room and told a room full of investors that I was unstable, unreliable, and frankly an embarrassment to this family's legacy, I didn't say a word. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table watching him. He mistook my silence for weakness, he always had. My name is Sloane. I'm 32 years old, and for most of my life, my older brother was the golden one, the one our father groomed to take over Whitmore Capital, our family's private equity firm, the one who got the corner office at 26, the one who gave speeches at charity galas while I sat in the back making sure the event logistics actually ran. I was 12 years younger than him, an oops baby, he used to say, laughing, like that was a funny thing to call your sister. Our father never corrected him. When my father died 3 years ago, he left the firm to my brother, all of it technically with a small clause buried in the estate documents that said I was entitled to a consulting role and a modest monthly allowance from the trust until I turned 35. My attorney friend, a woman I'd gone to law school with before I dropped out to help my mother through her illness, told me to fight it. I told her to wait. I had a plan, and my plan required patience. What most people didn't know, what my brother certainly didn't know, was that 2 years before my father died, when the firm was bleeding cash during a particularly bad market year, my father had come to me quietly. Not to my brother. To me. He needed a private loan to keep Whitmore Capital solvent through the quarter. He was too proud to go to a bank, too paranoid to tell his partners, and too stubborn to admit to my brother that the firm was struggling. So he came to me, because I was the quiet one, the careful one, the one who had spent 8 years building a small but serious commercial real estate portfolio, while everyone in the family assumed I was just doing something with properties. I had the money. I lent it to him, $2.4 million, structured as a formal secured loan, documented properly, with my attorney's help, with the firm's assets listed as collateral. My father signed it. I had it notarized. I kept the original in a safe deposit box at a bank in downtown Philadelphia that my brother didn't know existed. My father died before he repaid it. That made me a creditor of Whitmore Capital, not a beneficiary, not a charity case, not the little sister with her allowance. A creditor, senior secured. I never told my brother, I just waited. He didn't waste much time making my life difficult. Within 6 months of our father's funeral, he had quietly restructured my consulting role to mean essentially nothing. No access to financial records. No seat at strategy meetings. Invitations to nothing except the occasional family dinner where he could perform generosity in front of his wife and her parents. He reduced my allowance payments, citing cash flow adjustments. He told my mother, who was already fragile from grief, that I was struggling emotionally and not really in a place to be involved in business decisions. My mother believed him. That was the part that hurt the most. She looked at me with this soft, worried expression at Thanksgiving, patted my hand and said, "You know your brother only wants what's best for the family, Sloane." I smiled and said, "I know, Mom." What I knew was this. He had taken out 2 new lines of credit against the firm using assets that were already pledged as collateral on my loan. His attorneys either hadn't done proper lien searches or hadn't told him what they found. Either way, he had built his empire on a foundation with a crack in it that only I could see. I let him build. I watched. I waited. Then he brought in outside investors. The Investor Summit was his idea, a formal presentation to a consortium of 8 high-net-worth individuals he'd been courting for over a year. Old money, mostly. A few family offices. The kind of people who wore understated watches that cost more than most people's cars and asked very precise questions. He invited me as an afterthought. I found out later he told his assistant to add me to the guest list to show family unity. He assumed I would sit quietly in the back, maybe smile during the networking portion, and leave early. He gave me a seat at the far end of the long mahogany conference table. 13 people in the room. The room smelled like coffee and nervous energy and his very expensive cologne. He stood at the front, clicking through slides, talking about growth projections and portfolio performance and the Whitmore legacy of disciplined investing. He was good at it, I'll give him that. He had our father's voice, low and steady and certain. He knew how to make a room lean in. I sat at the end of the table and said nothing. About 40 minutes in, one of the investors, a quiet man named Mr. Ashford, who ran a family office out of Greenwich, raised his hand and asked a question I hadn't expected. Before we proceed, I'd like to understand the current liability structure of the firm. Specifically, are there any existing liens or secured obligations against the collateral assets listed in your deck? My brother smiled. Great question. We have 2 active credit facilities, both with standard commercial terms. Nothing unusual. Mr. Ashford nodded slowly. And no other secured positions? No private agreements? My brother said, none. The room was quiet for a moment. Then I said, that's not accurate. Every head at that table turned toward me. My brother's expression did something I'd never seen it do before. It flickered. Just for a second, this small involuntary confusion, before his face locked back into composure. Sloane, he said, with the patient tone of someone managing a difficult child, this isn't really the time. I'm a secured creditor of Whitmore Capital, I said. I kept my voice completely level. Senior position. Loan dated March 14th, 3 years ago. $2.4 million collateralized against the firm's primary asset holdings. The same holdings you just presented as unencumbered in your deck. Complete silence. Mr. Ashford set down his coffee cup. My brother laughed. It was a short, tight sound. There's no such loan. There is, I said. I reached into the leather portfolio I'd brought and set a copy of the loan agreement on the table. Notarized signature page on top. I have the original documentation with me as well. I'd be glad to provide copies to anyone who wants them. Nobody moved for a moment. Then one of the other investors quietly reached forward and picked up the document. My brother said, that's fabricated. I looked at him. Dad's signature is on it. So is his corporate seal. The notary record is public. You're welcome to pull it. His attorney, a man named Sutton who he'd hired away from a white shoe firm at enormous expense, stood up and asked everyone to take a short break. I watched him pull my brother to the side of the room by the window. I could see my brother's jaw working. I could see the moment Sutton said something that made his face go very still. Mr. Ashford approached me quietly. He was a small man, maybe 65, with careful eyes. He said, Miss Whitmore, how long have you held this position? 3 years, I said. He looked at me for a moment. And the loan is currently in default? 63 days past the final repayment date, I said. I've sent 3 formal notices. I have the certified mail receipts. He nodded once, very slowly, and returned to his seat. My brother walked back to the head of the table. His face was composed again. But something behind his eyes had changed. He said, I think there's been a misunderstanding about some old family financial arrangements, nothing that affects the firms. Mr. Ashford said, quietly but clearly, I think we'll need to pause today's discussions until the liability picture is clarified. 3 of the other investors nodded. My brother looked at me from across the table. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. What happened after that played out over the next 6 weeks. My attorney filed formal notice of the default and my intent to enforce the security interest. Sutton made several attempts to negotiate, first offering to pay back a portion of the principal, then questioning the validity of the notarization, then suggesting that my father couldn't have legally executed the agreement without board approval, which turned out to be incorrect because the agreement had been structured specifically to fall within the CEO's unilateral authority threshold at the time. Each argument collapsed. I had been careful. My attorney had been thorough. The documentation was clean. What my brother didn't know, what I don't think even occurred to him, was that I had spent 2 years quietly preparing for exactly this, not out of revenge, not exactly. More out of the conviction that if I was going to be pushed to the margins of something I had helped hold together, I wasn't going to let that happen without leaving myself a door. The enforcement process meant that Whitmore Capital's primary assets, the real estate holdings, the fund interests, the office building my brother had renovated at the firm's expense and had his name put on a plaque in the lobby, were subject to my claim. The 2 newer credit facilities he'd taken out were junior to mine. Both banks were not pleased when they got the full picture. He could have avoided the worst of it if he'd come to me directly early on. If he'd just said, "Let's figure this out, let's restructure, let's talk," I would have talked. I believe in workable solutions, but he chose to attack because attacking had always been easier than acknowledging that I existed. He issued a statement through sentence saying that I was pursuing a misguided and malicious legal strategy and that the loan agreement was a product of our father's diminished capacity in his final months. He sent the statement to the firm's partners. He then incredibly called my mother and told her I was destroying the family. My mother called me the same evening upset, asking me what I was doing. I sat down with her in person. I showed her the loan agreement. I showed her the repayment schedule that my father had personally signed. I showed her the 3 default notices that had been sent to my brother's registered address and signed for by members of his staff. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He never told me any of this." "I know," I said. She looked up the notarized signature on the loan document, our father's handwriting, unmistakable, the same looping capital W he'd used on birthday cards my whole childhood, and she pressed her lips together and didn't say anything else about it. The investor consortium meeting was the moment everything shifted publicly, but the private reckoning came a few weeks later at an emergency partners meeting at the firm's offices. My brother had called it to present a resolution plan. I was not on the initial invite list. My attorney sent a letter noting that as a senior secured creditor with a pending enforcement action, I had standing to attend. My brother's team pushed back. A judge disagreed with them. I walked into that office building on a Tuesday morning in March. The lobby had his name on a placard by the elevator bank. I rode up to the 14th floor. The partners were already seated when I arrived. 7 of them, men and women who had worked alongside my father for decades, who had sent flowers when he died, who had shaken my hand at his memorial and said kind things. Most of them looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. A couple of them nodded. My brother was standing at the head of the table. He looked like he hadn't slept. His suit was perfect. He always had a perfect suit, but his eyes were tired in a way that was new. He started by saying that the loan claim was under dispute and that the partners should not make any decisions based on one party's version of events. He talked for about 12 minutes. He used words like destabilizing and coordinated attack, and at one point said that my behavior was consistent with someone who has always had difficulty accepting boundaries. I let him finish. Then one of the senior partners, a woman named Miss Everett, who had joined the firm the same year I was born and who I had always privately admired, looked at me and said, "Sloane, do you want to respond?" "Yes," I said. I prepared a 12-page summary document, clear sections, numbered exhibits, the loan agreement, the notary records, the default notices, the lien filing, a comparative analysis showing that the firm's asset presentation to investors had been materially inaccurate given the existence of my senior secured position. I set a copy in front of each person at the table. I said, "My father built this firm over 40 years. He brought me in, quietly, privately, when it needed help. I helped him. I documented it properly. I've waited 3 years. I'm not asking for anything that wasn't already mine." The room was very quiet. Ms. Everett said, "I'd like to take a 10-minute recess to review the exhibit summary." My brother said, "This is a performance. She's been planning this for years." Ms. Everett looked at him. "I know," she said. "She prepared. That's the point." The resolution took another 3 weeks to finalize. My brother did not lose everything. I want to be clear about that because I think the story is more honest that way. What he lost was control. The partners voted to bring in an independent management committee while the financial restructuring was worked out. The 2 junior lenders negotiated a modification. My claim was settled with a combination of cash and an equity position that gave me a formal, documented stake in the firm, not a consulting role, not an allowance, but actual ownership on paper with my name on it. He kept his title for another 2 months and then quietly stepped back, citing personal health reasons. His wife's family, who had been very interested in the investor summit and its abrupt collapse, became conspicuously less present at family events. My mother had dinner with me the week after the settlement. She made pot roast, which she used to make when I was small and had a bad day at school. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd done my homework for 15 years, and she said, "Your father would have been proud of you." I said, "I think Dad would have been complicated about it." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in what felt like a long time. "You're probably right," she said. "There's a thing people say about revenge, that it won't make you feel better, that it hollows you out, that you'll be left empty afterward. I don't think what I did was revenge. I think it was documentation. I think it was patience. I think it was refusing to let someone rewrite the story of what I had contributed and what I was owed, even when it would have been much easier to just take the allowance and be quiet. I still pass that office building sometimes. His name is still on the lobby placard. They haven't changed it yet, and honestly, I don't care if they ever do. I own part of what's inside." The morning after the settlement was finalized, I drove out to the cemetery where my father is buried. It was early enough that the grass was still damp. I sat next to his headstone for a few minutes and didn't say anything out loud, because that's not really how I talk to people. But I thought, "I took care of it, Dad." I thought, "I was careful, like you taught me." I thought, "I know you didn't mean for it to go this way, but you did leave me the door. You just didn't tell him." Then I got in my car and drove back to the city, because I had a 9 o'clock call and a firm to help rebuild. I used to think the hardest part of what happened was the silence. All those months of watching my brother dismantle what I'd helped build, listening to him tell our mother I was struggling, sitting across from him at dinners where he performs generosity like it was a sport. That silence cost me something. I won't pretend it didn't. But I've thought about it a lot since, and I think the silence was also the most honest thing I did. Because I wasn't quiet out of fear. I was quiet because I had already done the work. And there's a difference between those two things that I think most people never figure out. The difference between shutting up because you feel powerless and staying still because you know exactly where you stand. My father taught me that, actually, without meaning to. He was a man who believed in doing things correctly, not perfectly, but correctly. Documentation, due diligence, getting the right people to witness the right things at the right time. He brought me in when the firm was in trouble, not my brother, and I've spent a long time sitting with what that meant. I think it meant he knew something about character that he couldn't say out loud. He trusted me with the hard thing, and I honored that by being careful. That's the part I want to be honest about. It wasn't cleverness that saved me. Plenty of clever people lose everything because they cut corners or assume the world will sort itself out in their favor. What saved me was that I didn't skip steps. I had an attorney review every line. I had the notary do it properly. I kept the original in a deposit box and checked on it. For 3 years, I did the boring, unglamorous work of being prepared. That's not a dramatic skill. It's just integrity applied consistently over time, long after the moment where it felt exciting. And then there's the question of what I was actually doing all those years while my brother ran the firm and I was supposedly just doing something with properties. I was building. Quietly, without permission or announcement. There's something I've come to believe about that period. The people who tell you that you're irrelevant are almost always people who need you to believe it more than you do. My brother needed me to accept the margin. I just didn't. That's not bravery. Bravery implies you're not afraid. I was afraid, plenty of times. Afraid my documentation had some flaw I hadn't seen. Afraid the partners would side with him out of loyalty. Afraid my mother would never fully understand. What I had instead of bravery was something more like stubbornness in a good direction. A refusal to let someone else's version of me become the one I operated from. Miss Everett said something in that partners meeting that I've thought about since. She said, "She prepared. That's the point." 7 words. But she wasn't just talking about the documents. She was talking about the kind of person who treats their own future as worth protecting, who does the hard work in private, without applause, because they believe the outcome matters. I think about the people who watched that investor presentation unravel and assumed I had been plotting something ruthless. I wasn't. I had simply refused to be erased. That's a much smaller and more ordinary thing. It's available to anyone willing to do the quiet work, keep the records, and wait. What my brother never understood is that the moment he decided I didn't matter, he stopped paying attention to me. And people who stop paying attention to you hand you a very specific kind of advantage. I used it. I don't have any grand conclusion about justice or fairness. The world isn't fair. I know that as well as anyone. But I do think that how you carry yourself through unfair circumstances, whether you stay honest, stay sharp, stay patient, tends to compound over time in ways that matter. It did for me. And I drove back to the city the morning after the settlement and took my 9 o'clock call, because that's who I'd been the whole time.